All right. For another one of these today, I wanted to talk about this idea that all of reality at some level kind of flows from math, and more particularly from number theory and counting. And the reason I say that is because, at some level, the main distinction is there separation between things? Are there distinct things within reality that basically you can identify, assign identity to, I guess would be the best description, maybe symbology, something along those lines. But that basically exist as distinct things. And so then it's, the number of those things that you can kind of identify and point out. And then each one of those in some level kind of adds complexity. Because, the more of these things you have, the more ways that they can kind of interact, and the more sets and positions and types that they can all be put in. And you can kind of see this in the way that a lot of the combinatoric math works. You add just a few more pieces and you get a ridiculous number of new, basically, sets and positions and kind of tilings and things like that you can do in 2D space and 3D space. But where I get to from this, though, is that, for example, if you have nothing, or a lot of these things, they always start with the idea that you have actually kind of nothing and all things. It's kind of like absolute potential. Or maybe like absolute innocence. You have the possibility to do whatever. Reality could be whatever the heck you want. And in this dream sense, it's kind of that idea of first coming into a dream, and the dream could be whatever. But there's nothing there yet, and so then basically all of that kind of is nascent and possible. But, at the same extent, it could also be the other side of it, where it kind of has looped around and literally almost everything has been seen. All of the most extremes of not, all the most extremes of is have kind of been witnessed and seen, and so you're almost like looping around the back end of time and kind of, coming back to that same point. And then I assume it would kind of be a restart of the cycle, or a change, or a diversification of the cycle. But anyways, from that point, then you could make either nothingness or you could make everythingness, and I think you would get basically to the same point. For example, like if you had absolute nothingness and it had something came and observed it, then it would probably actually generate somethingness. For example, there probably is a place somewhere where there still is nothing, like a dimension of nothing. But if you went and observed it and even touched it, it would probably start having things, because it would then have your observation as like a reference point. And so, in this reality, basically anything that came into this reality would be like the immediate reference point. The very first thing would it could be one, or, any number almost. But that would kind of set the scaling for reality. And the only way to really represent one thing in a visual way is usually a point. But the problem is those are always kind of virtual. So if you try to draw it, it's always, some physical diameter that just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. But at some level, it's always still kind of like a ring. It's like the point at some level is like there's still always in the ring and outside the ring. It's just like inside the ring theoretically could be infinitely small, or it could be infinitely large. It's effectively kind of it is a singularity in space. And so then, from that, though, the ring becomes kind of this basic idea, and you can really see that like everywhere. Everything in reality is based on these ring structures. Atoms are all kind of rings. Our bodies are kind of rings that have turned into spheres that have then been basically pulled and distorted. Really, you could collapse our whole bodies basically back into a sphere, and then eventually back into a ring if you kind of took away the 3D-ness of it all. Because we're a closed surface, and as long as we're a closed surface, then we're pretty good. Although we do actually have openings. We actually have toroidal cuts or whatever. I can't remember what the exact term for that is. But we have those kind of spaces that basically puncture through to the inside world and to the outside world. And then that's kind of, that second idea, which is that you have like difference. Because, then like if you have nothingness or you have everythingness, either one would kind of make the other one, because whatever was different would be the most distinct thing possible. And so then everything would kind of scale from that, which actually has kind of a color aspect too, because then like if the original thing is pretty light, then everything will be kind of pretty light. It'll just be gradations of it. If the original thing is kind of dark, then everything will be kind of dark, and the gradations will be, the light and the dark within that. But, you would get a division. And And so then that kind of becomes this whole, like, the waters and the light above and all that kind of stuff, which shows up a lot in a bunch of symbology. But it's still this basic idea, you have like all of creation and then lack. And then from there you'd get like number 3, which would be basically like a point resting on that line, which is kind of, like having a kid or something basically between, creation and notness. But in some sense, that's also kind of like Mercury. It's like this planet that basically is, right on the borderline between like being in the sun and not being in the sun. And from its perspective, like its whole horizon is basically just a wash of fire. I mean, like if you were sitting on the hot side of Mercury, I mean, it would look like basically just fire stretching off to the boundary of the horizon. And so that's, kind of the first extreme of that example is basically this dot, this ring, again, basically sitting on the border of light and dark. But then, like in a lot of the stories, it kind of naturally basically flows outward because, all of kind of dad's love is very washing away and, mom is kind of always basically pulling and calling. And so, it moves outward kind of into the darkness. But then, you still get repetitions of this same idea. Everything that comes after that is also kind of, these ring ideas. And even some of this stuff on Mercury, like, on Mercury, there are kind of 2 rings. There's one on the hot side, this Apollodonus feature, and there's one on the backside. And the Apollodonus kind of looks like an angel smacked into the surface. And then the one on the opposite side is this thing called the weird terrain, and it kind of looks like a bunch of tentacles on the backside. But, and actually they form like a dipole across basically Mercury. Kind of like you had put 2 more dots, one on the hot side, one on the dark side of Mercury. Or maybe like a ripple went through Mercury or something like that, like an antipode mode. But either way, it's still this same basic concept, more rings on that. Then, when you move out into the outer planets or the inner planets, but, further out from Mercury, you still have the same kind of concept too. You would have Venus, which would be, more towards the sun. And then, things basically over on Mars, kind of this cold side planet, and then basically resting in the middle, you have kind of balanced planet. You have Earth here, plus with all of our moon cycle stuff and things as well, which, further reinforces that idea of basically this light, dark balance and the cycling of it all and things like that. But, I mean, each of these things, too, it's like, you can kind of think of it like, if it was Mercury initially, and Mercury was kind of sitting literally almost on a line of like white and black, then if you went out from Mercury, then in some sense the line that would represent the light would kind of curve in around the sun. And so then everything becomes kind of like that, is further stepping back away from this kind of line of like the white sun into all these other kind of ring realities and realms and places where, we exist. Yeah, but it's interesting, too, because it works kind of in like a spiritual sense and it works in a material sense. Because, like I talked about one of the earlier ones, digestion is one of these first basic things, too, that we think of in a material sense, when life arose. And it's very much like, you have the inside and you have the outside, and it's kind of time flowing forward. And it's like, these 2 antipodes and basically a line running through you, and you basically take whatever in, experience, food, all these sensations, things like that, and then, pass them out. But same basic concept, and even like the imagery is the same. A little cell with basically a line straight down through the center of it or something like that, where it's basically, taking in life and then putting it out. And then very similarly, it gets into cell division, the same kind of basic idea is that, you start with a thing, then the thing kind of breaks in 2s, then it breaks some more, but it's always this kind of structural breaking of a central object, and repetition of a theme, which again is rings. It's circular cell structures. It's circular atoms within those cell structures. It's circular organs. And, because you can look at most of, like, our organs within our bodies and stuff like that, and if they're not a direct sphere or something like that, then a lot of the time they're kind of like a passageway or a channel which was just kind of stretched or pulled, or elongated or something like that. And eventually those could all kind of also collapse backwards, basically back into straight lines or into direct connections, things like that. It's always just kind of this pulling and stretching and distortion effect that's going on. Anyway, all for that one. On the next, I'll probably talk about like some of the ideas of color and how when you get some more of these types of objects and separations, it almost inherently drops into an idea of colorness.